It was a Tuesday morning in Hong Kong, the kind of gray, humid morning that made the harbor smell like rust and salt. The Kowloon railway station was alive with the usual chaos: porters dragging luggage carts over the concrete, vendors calling out prices for newspapers and steamed buns, pigeons dodging between the legs of commuters who hadn't quite woken up yet. The station loudspeaker announced arrivals and departures in Cantonese and English, its tinny voice swallowed almost instantly by the ambient roar of a city in motion. Among the crowd stood a young man of medium build, lean but not thin, compact but not small. He wore simple dark trousers and a plain cotton shirt, nothing that would mark him out from the hundreds of others waiting for the morning train to Guangzhou. His eyes, however, were different. They were alert in a way that most eyes are not, scanning without staring, taking in the whole platform at once, the way a hawk takes in a hillside from a thermal current high above it. This was Bruce Lee, 23 years old, freshly returned from Seattle, and carrying within him a fire that most people never feel and almost no one ever sees. He was buying a ticket. That was all. A simple transaction at the counter, the exchange of a few coins for a small paper rectangle that would carry him from one city to another. He wasn't thinking about fighting. He wasn't rehearsing techniques or meditating on philosophy. He was buying a train ticket, which is a very ordinary thing to do. The great mistake is to anticipate the outcome of the engagement. You ought not to be thinking of whether it ends in victory or defeat. Just let nature take its course, and your tools will strike at the right moment. He had spoken those words to his students only a week before, standing on the scrubbed wooden floor of a small backroom dojo in Kowloon. None of those students were here now. He was alone in the crowd, anonymous, unhurried. The ticket clerk slid his change across the counter, and Bruce pocketed it without counting it. He turned from the counter and began walking toward the platform. Part 2, the shoulder that, is when the man appeared. He was enormous, not in the exaggerated way of a fairground strongman, but in the genuine structural way of a person whose body had been built by years of hard physical labor. He stood a full head taller than Bruce, and his shoulders were so wide that people on either side of him stepped back instinctively, as though they sensed something in the air, the way animals sense an approaching storm. He weighed, by the estimate of those who saw him that morning, somewhere close to 190 kilograms. His neck was as thick as most men's thighs. His hands were the size of small shovels. He was moving fast, too fast for a man his size. The kind of speed that comes from a combination of mass and absolute indifference to anything in his path. He was cutting across the concourse in a diagonal line, heading for a train on the far platform, and he was looking at his watch rather than at the people ahead of him. Or perhaps he was looking at the people ahead of him and simply did not consider them worth going around. Whatever his intention, the result was the same. His shoulder, a dense, heavy object, more like a piece of architecture than a body part, struck Bruce Lee squarely as he turned from the ticket counter. It was not a glancing blow. It was a full, solid impact, delivered with all the momentum of a nearly 200-kilogram man moving at a purposeful pace. Smaller men had been knocked clean off their feet by less. The people nearest to the collision froze. A woman dropped her shopping bag. A porter stopped mid-stride, his cart rolling 2 meters before it bumped softly against a pillar. The ticket clerk looked up from his counter. The pigeons near the entrance scattered upward in a pale gray flutter. For one long, elastic second, time on platform 7 seemed to stretch and thin like taffy. Part 3, 4 seconds here, is what happened in those 4 seconds. Not mythology, not cinema. What actually happened, as witnessed by nearly a dozen people who would later tell the story to friends, journalists, and other martial artists over the following decades. Bruce Lee did not stumble. He did not pitch forward or backward. He absorbed the impact the way a willow tree absorbs wind, by yielding without breaking, by becoming briefly fluid and then becoming solid again. His feet adjusted, his center of gravity shifted, and within the first fraction of the first second, he was already balanced. His eyes, which had been scanning the platform ahead, dropped to the man beside him. They took in everything at once: height, weight, posture, the angle of the shoulders, the position of the feet, the direction of momentum, the expression on the face. The face. That was telling. There was no apology in it. There was barely awareness, just the vague, dismissive look of a large man who has spent his whole life having other people get out of his way, and who has never had any serious reason to question that arrangement. He glanced down at the compact figure he had just struck with all the brief interest of a person who has accidentally stepped on a small stone. He had already begun to look away, already begun to move forward again. Bruce did not speak. He did not raise his voice, point a finger, or adopt any of the postures that human beings use to signal that a confrontation is coming. What Bruce did was step. One single, precise step, not forward, not backward, but slightly to the side and slightly forward. A positioning that placed him at a very particular angle relative to the large man's body. Those who studied Wing Chun, the martial art in which Bruce had been trained since childhood, would have recognized the footwork immediately. Those who did not study Wing Chun would only have seen a man take a step and wondered why that step had so much intention in it. The large man turned. He turned because something in his peripheral vision caught him. Perhaps the movement. Perhaps some primal signal that the air around him had changed, that the landscape of the encounter was no longer quite what he had assumed it to be. He turned, and he found himself looking at Bruce Lee's face. And he found that Bruce Lee's face was calm. Perfectly calm. Not the frozen calm of fear, not the rigid calm of someone fighting to control panic, but the natural calm of water at rest. No tension in the jaw, no narrowing of the eyes, no pulse visible in the throat. Just a face, looking back at him, with a patience in it that was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Part our fourth, the stillness later. When people tried to explain what happened next, they often struggled with the language of it. They would say things like, "The big man seemed to get smaller," or "The air around him changed," or, most commonly, "We didn't quite see what happened, but suddenly, the big man was very still, and Bruce Lee was still where he had been, and everything had stopped." What they were trying to describe was the physics of the situation as it now presented itself, not the physics of motion, but the physics of potential. The stillness before the kinetic event, the compressed spring. The arrow that has not yet left the bow, but whose departure is already, in some sense, already done. The large man was still because he understood, somewhere beneath the level of conscious thought, beneath the level where his size and strength and history of casual dominance operated, that the small man in front of him was not reacting the way things were supposed to react. The social contract that had governed his physical interactions his entire life, in which his size was the argument and other people's retreat was the answer, had suddenly been voided. The small man had not retreated. The small man had stepped, slightly, to one side and slightly forward, and had looked at him with the patience of someone who was waiting for a bus. And the whole familiar geography of the encounter had become terrain the large man did not recognize. In those 4 seconds, the large man had become aware, slowly, reluctantly, with the dawning discomfort of a person who has misread a situation, that he was not the most dangerous thing on this platform. Part V. What Bruce said. Bruce Lee spoke 2 sentences. They were quiet enough that only the people immediately nearest heard them clearly, though the ripple of the moments spread outward through the platform like the rings from a stone dropped in still water. He said, "You should be more careful." And then, after a pause in which the large man said absolutely nothing, he said, "These platforms get crowded." That was all. He pocketed his train ticket, turned, and walked to his platform. He did not look back. His pace was unhurried. His hands were relaxed at his sides. He moved through the crowd the way he always moved, not parting it by force, but by some quality of presence that caused people to naturally create space. The way water creates space around a stone, it cannot move. The large man stood in the concourse for a moment longer. The crowd that had paused around him began slowly to resume its motion, the way a flock of birds resumes its murmuration after a hawk has passed. The woman who had dropped her shopping bag picked it up. The porter retrieved his cart. The pigeon settled. The large man did not board his train immediately. Witnesses said he stood for a while, looking in the direction Bruce had gone, with an expression no one could quite name. Part VI. The philosophy behind the stillness. Bruce Lee was not a peaceful man by nature. That is important to understand. He was, by his own admission, intensely competitive, easily provoked in his youth, quick to anger, hungry for challenge. The stories from his teenage years in Hong Kong are full of rooftop fights, gang confrontations, altercations with police that forced his parents to send him to Seattle in 1959, partly to keep him out of serious legal trouble. He was not someone who had been born into serenity and grown up there undisturbed. What he had done, over years of study, of Wing Chun under the legendary Ip Man, of Western boxing, of philosophy, of the writings of Krishnamurti and Lao Tzu, was learn to choose when to engage, and when to let stillness do the work that movement could not do better. This was not passivity. It was a higher form of activity, and it was, in many ways, more demanding than simply striking back. Ip Man had taught him, the true test of a fighter is not what he does when attacked, but whether he can resist the pull to prove himself when there is nothing to prove. Bruce had been a slow learner in this regard, but he had eventually learned. The encounter at the railway station was a small thing in the calendar of a life that would go on to encompass films seen by hundreds of millions of people, a philosophy of martial arts that would reshape the discipline worldwide, and a death at 32 that would feel, to those who had watched him move, like the extinction of something irreplaceable. By the scale of those events, one encounter at one ticket counter on one Tuesday morning was barely a footnote. And yet the people who witnessed it, the ticket clerk, the porter, the woman with the shopping bag, the handful of commuters who happened to be close enough to see the whole thing from beginning to end, they all remembered it. Some of them remembered it more vividly than events far more dramatic in their own lives. They remembered it because it had the quality of something that has been compressed into a very small space and contains a great deal more than it seems to. Epilogue. What the platform learned when people ask what martial arts are really for, they sometimes expect the answer to involve boards being broken, attackers being defeated, tournaments being won. These things exist, and they are real, but they are not the answer. The answer is closer to what happened on a Hong Kong railway platform on a gray Tuesday morning in the early 1960s. A large man collided with a smaller man and was certain, in the first fraction of the first second, that the geometry of the encounter was entirely in his favor. And then something shifted. Not a punch, not a throw, not a demonstration of technique, but a step and a look and a quality of stillness that communicated, without words and without threat, that the geometry was not what he had supposed. 4 seconds. A platform came to a standstill, and then life resumed, as it always does, and the trains departed on their schedules, and the crowd moved on. And somewhere in a third-class carriage, a young man with alert eyes looked out at the gray harbor water and thought about what comes next. He always thought about what comes next. That was the thing about him. He was never really still at all. Even in stillness, he was already moving. Even in silence, he was already speaking. Even standing at a ticket counter buying a train ticket, he was in some essential sense already Bruce Lee. And the platform knew it. Even when he was just a stranger in a plain cotton shirt, the platform knew it.